Welcome. Please comment down below what time it is wherever you are right now. Let's get to it. In January 2015, a Phoenix detective invited a man to lunch at Chili's under the guise of a security job interview. The man ordered a hamburger and water. What he didn't know was that investigators were secretly watching, and that when the mug left the table, it would finally seal his fate. 11 days later, Brian Patrick Miller was under arrest for murders committed more than 2 decades earlier. How did one meal end a 23-year hunt for the Canal Killer? This case is one of the most bizarre true crime cases in the US history. At 16 years old, Brian Patrick Miller was a tall, quiet teenager living in Phoenix. On the surface, he did not stand out much from other boys his age. He had a small circle of friends, spent his time tinkering with his bike, and was usually seen riding it alone through the neighborhoods. But in November of 1989, his life and the lives of people around him changed in a way almost no one saw coming. That month, Miller carried out an act so sudden and so violent that it did not fit with what people thought they knew about him. The victim was Celeste Bentley, a woman he did not appear to know personally. The reports from that time describe it as an apparently random encounter. Bentley was walking near a street in Phoenix when Miller approached her without warning. In what detectives later called a deliberate motion, he pulled out a knife and stabbed her. The wound was severe enough that she collapsed to the ground in shock. She survived the attack, but the nature of the assault was alarming. There was no robbery, no argument, and no visible trigger. It seemed calculated, as though the decision had been made in advance rather than in the heat of the moment. Witnesses who saw the moments after said Miller did not flee in a panic. He left the scene quickly, but not in a wild rush. This detail stayed with investigators because it did not resemble the typical reaction of an impulsive teenager who had suddenly lost control. When police arrived, they collected statements and evidence, eventually identifying Miller as the suspect in the stabbing. He was arrested the same day. At that time, violent crimes committed by minors often resulted in sentences served in juvenile facilities rather than adult prisons, especially if the victim survived. The courts handled his case under those guidelines. Prosecutors described the stabbing in court, but without a clear motive, the case felt incomplete. Miller was sentenced to serve time in juvenile detention. The sentence lasted just over 1 year, a relatively short period considering the intentional use of a weapon and the level of harm caused. From a law enforcement standpoint, there was little follow-up once his time was served. Juvenile records were often sealed, and unless there was ongoing supervision, the case essentially ended when the detention term expired. For Miller, this meant he was back in the community before his 18th birthday. There were no long-term mental health interventions documented, and no specialized monitoring after his release. Those who later studied the case pointed to the attack as an early warning sign. Unprovoked knife assaults, especially by minors, are statistically rare. When they do happen, and when no motive, like theft or gang violence, is attached, psychologists often consider the possibility of deeper factors at play, like underlying aggression, planning tendencies, or antisocial behavior traits. At the time, though, these considerations did not lead to concrete action. Miller's family life during this period was complex. He had a strained relationship with his mother. Although she remained in touch while he was held in detention, she lived close enough to visit and occasionally checked his belongings. Her role in this story became more important months later when she stumbled on something that would disturb her for years to come. While going through items in her home that belonged to her son, she found a piece of paper folded down to fit neatly inside a notebook. Written across the top in plain block letters was a single word: plan. The neatness of the fold and the deliberate title caught her attention. When she opened it, she found writing that described in chilling detail a sequence of events involving the capture, sexual assault, and murder of a young woman. It went further than that, mentioning the dismemberment of the body. This was not creative fiction or the vague ramblings of an angry teenager. It was structured like a checklist, laying out stages of a crime from start to finish. The words were sparse but precise. They did not name a specific person. They did not give an exact location. Instead, they described the physical acts in a sequence that implied forethought and emotional detachment. Psychologists often explain that such writings can be significant predictors of future violence, especially when they combine sexual elements with post-mortem actions like dismemberment. It was not a passing thought jotted down in a diary. It was an outlined progression, suggesting the writer had visualized carrying it out. When his mother found the note, the decision on what to do with it was hers. She later admitted being deeply unsettled by its content. Still, there is no record of formal follow-up from law enforcement tied directly to that discovery. Whether it was simply not reported in a way that triggered police action, or whether it was dismissed as disturbing teenage writing remains unclear. What is known is that no charges, court programs, or mental health interventions came from it. From a hindsight perspective, the stabbing of Celeste Bentley could be seen as a practical test of capacity, whether this teenager could injure someone on purpose and walk away. The note marked "plan" could be viewed as the internal blueprint for something even more extreme. The gap between those two moments, a crime acted out and one set down on paper, would later feel like the pause between the first and second steps of a much larger process. During his detention, Miller's daily life followed the routine of other juveniles. The facilities housed teenagers with a range of offences, from property crimes to violent assaults. Group activities were structured and education was provided. But the system then was not designed to uncover or address violent fantasies unless the juvenile volunteered them. Behaviour was monitored mostly for compliance, not for signs of ongoing dangerous thinking. If a young offender followed the rules, finished their sentence, and avoided fights, they could pass through the program without deeper psychological evaluation. Miller did just that. When his time was served, he returned home in the early 1990s, appearing much as he had before. Outwardly, it was as though the stabbing incident had been addressed, a juvenile offence, handled within the juvenile system, time served. Beneath that surface, any unaddressed impulses, plans, or obsessions simply had more time to grow without being detected. In the years that followed, there was nothing in the public record to suggest that police were keeping an eye on him. There were no parole-like check-ins because, as a juvenile, he had served his sentence in full. This administrative closure meant that any transition into greater dangerousness would not be noticed until far later. Had the note called "plan" been entered into an official file, it might have looked like a clear and present risk. Instead, it remained a disturbing piece of paper kept in private memory. For those who would later investigate the Canal Murders, the events of 1989 were no longer an isolated dark moment. They were the recorded beginning of a pattern. At 16, Miller had shown he could approach a stranger and use lethal force without provocation. He had followed that with a written outline for even more severe violence. But in real time, this pattern was seen only as a closed juvenile case, with no formal connection drawn between the two markers. And so, by the time he left detention, the threat was not gone. It was simply quiet. While locked up, another piece of the puzzle had already emerged, hidden away not in public records, but in a single sheet of paper folded inside a personal notebook. During the months that Brian Patrick Miller was locked inside juvenile detention, his mother came across something buried in his belongings at home. It was not stuffed into a drawer by accident. It had been folded neatly, as though it was meant to be kept safe. Across the top, in block letters, a single word stood out: plan. At first glance, it could have been anything. A homework outline, a schedule, maybe a list of jobs to do when he came home. But when she opened it, the reality was far from routine. What she read was not a story written for school or a venting diary entry. It was a step-by-step outline of an imagined crime. Each sentence was short, and each one described an act that connected to the next. It began with taking hold of a young woman, using the word abduct, and then went on to describe sexual assault. After that, the sentences detailed killing her, then cutting her up. There were even mentions of what to do with the body afterward. The words were flat and direct, without emotion or embellishment, and they were written in a way that suggested the person writing them could see the process happening in their mind. The specificity made it different from the kind of violent language that some teens might use for shock value. There was no fantasy element, no monsters or imaginary settings, nothing that indicated it was fiction. The outline read more like a checklist than a creative piece. It did not name a victim or give dates, but it gave enough of a structure that someone could follow it as instructions. People who study violent offenders often say that when thoughts of harming others move from vague ideas into written plans, it signals a different level of intent. Writing down steps gives permanence to the thoughts and can serve as a rehearsal for carrying them out. Miller's mother was disturbed by what she found. She later described the writing as cold, and the mention of dismemberment deeply unsettled her. While some parents might dismiss a troubling passage if it seemed tied to fiction or horror media, the language here was too blunt and procedural. The choice of words like sexual assault, kill, and cut body made the intent unmistakable. Finding something like this in a teenager's private belongings raises obvious concerns about safety and state of mind. What happened after she found the note is less clear. There is no record of an official police report being filed, and no evidence that the discovery led to a new investigation while Miller was still in detention. Whether she told authorities at the facility or decided to keep it within the family has never been fully documented. At that time, juvenile detention centers focused on the offense that brought someone in and on monitoring their conduct inside. Unless a detainee openly threatened to act on a violent plan, staff might not treat personal writings as evidence of a future crime. The lack of follow-up may also have been due to the era. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, there was less public awareness about warning signs in young offenders and fewer systems to intervene based on predictive behavior alone. Even when concerning writings were disclosed, the legal tools for acting on them were limited unless the content explicitly threatened a specific, identifiable person. Without that, the note would have been seen as disturbing but not necessarily actionable. To family members, though, the implications could be clear. This was not a passing thought. It was a script. Psychologists who study people who later commit violent crimes often point out that ideas involving both sexual assault and dismemberment represent a particularly dangerous mindset. Sexual violence already suggests an intent to dominate and control, but the inclusion of mutilation points to something beyond that, an interest in erasing or destroying the victim's identity after death. In some offenders, this combination is linked to long-standing fantasies that they revisit mentally until they feel compelled to act. The level of planning in Miller's plan note fit that pattern. It showed a connection between sexual harm and physical destruction in a progression that ended with disposal. Looking back, the mention of cutting up the body in that note feels even more important because of what would later happen along the canals of Phoenix. Years after this note was written, one of the victims in the canal murders would be found not only sexually assaulted and murdered, but also decapitated. The similarity between that actual crime scene and the written sequence in Miller's teenage note would stand out to investigators once the connection was finally made. At the time, though, there was no way for anyone to link those future acts to the folded paper his mother had opened. The idea that such an early warning could go unaddressed is difficult to hear, especially for those who have seen the later case files. But in juvenile justice, information often stays siloed. A parent can tell a counselor about something they found, but unless there is a legal reason to share it with law enforcement outside the facility, it goes no further. In Miller's case, the stabbing that put him in detention was the only offense being managed. The broader risk he might pose to strangers in the future was not formally evaluated, and this written plan stayed outside the official record. It is impossible to know if intervention at that stage could have changed what would happen years later. Some offenders respond to therapy, monitoring, or strict legal oversight. Others hide their thoughts until they can act without interference. What is certain is that Miller completed his time in juvenile detention with no added restrictions. When he walked out, he carried no criminal record that would follow him into adult life, because juvenile adjudications in Arizona were sealed. He was legally a free man, even before he turned 18. The disturbing note his mother had found remained in her possession, or memory, but it played no role in preventing contact with potential victims later on. And as far as the public was concerned, Brian Patrick Miller was just another young man starting life over after a teenage offense. Behind closed doors, though, he had already written himself into the role he would later take in real life. The plan was more than words on paper. It was an early, compressed version of crimes that would eventually be committed with actual victims. Each phase of that writing, abduction, sexual assault, murder, then mutilation, would find its mirror in the events investigators later documented along the Phoenix canals. In that way, the note operates almost like a prophecy fulfilled, except that it was the author himself who brought it to life. A few years after his release, those violent ideas would no longer be confined to folded paper tucked away in a drawer. They would move from private writing to public act, and the quiet teenager who had stabbed a stranger at 16 would emerge again, this time leaving behind scenes that could not be mistaken for anything but the work of a killer. In the early 1990s, Phoenix was growing fast. New housing developments stretched out into the desert, and freeways carried more traffic each year. Through it all ran a network of canals, built decades earlier to bring water into the city. They cut quietly through neighborhoods and industrial areas, lined with wide gravel paths many people used for jogging, biking, or an evening walk. For some residents, they were places to escape the noise of the streets. For someone looking for potential victims, the paths offered access, isolation, and predictable routines. On the evening of November 8, 1992, Angela Brosso set out on her bike for a ride along one of those canal paths. She was just 2 days away from turning 22 and was living in an apartment near the canal with her boyfriend. Friends and family described her as active and independent. She chose her route for exercise, but also because it was a familiar area to her. The ride should have taken about 45 minutes. She did not come home. When she did not return that night, her boyfriend reported her missing. Officers began with a search of the area, using flashlights to scan along the canal banks and nearby paths. There was no sign of her or her bicycle. The search continued into the next day. On November 9, a man walking along the canal spotted something in the water near a drainage grate. It was Angela's body. She had been sexually assaulted and then decapitated. The sheer violence of the crime shocked the responding officers. The scene offered little in the way of immediate leads. Her bike was not there. There were no witnesses who saw the attack. Detectives processed the area carefully, but without the technology that would become available years later, DNA and trace evidence were harder to work with. The discovery of her head came more than a week later, on November 20. It was found about a mile and a half from where her body had been recovered, also in the canal. That recovery allowed medical examiners to take a closer look at the injuries, but it did little to answer the question of who had done it. Among investigators, the brutality set this murder apart from the kinds of cases they usually saw. Homicide detectives in Phoenix dealt with stabbings, shootings, and occasional domestic-related killings, but not crimes involving sexual assault, followed by decapitation. The manner of the killing suggested someone who was not acting in a moment of uncontrolled rage. The steps taken after death indicated time, a certain comfort with what they were doing, and no need to leave the scene immediately. Recovery crews had to work slowly to avoid damaging evidence. Canals in Phoenix carry silt and debris, making it difficult to locate objects underwater. Divers had limited visibility, often less than a foot in front of them. Even the bicycle, a bright purple mountain bike belonging to Angela, was not located right away. Months later, small pieces of evidence tied to the case washed up along the banks, but most did not yield useful information. The attack changed how people who lived near the canals felt about them. Before Angela's murder, women jogged in the early morning or just before sunset without much fear. Groups of friends would meet there for exercise or fishing. After the news spread, the sight of patrol cars parked near access points became more common. Parents told teenagers to avoid riding bikes there alone. The story of the murder ran on local TV for days, including the fact that her head had been found separately from her body. It was not information Phoenix was used to hearing in connection with their own city. Detectives interviewed dozens of people, from residents who lived near the canal to others who had been out biking that night. They checked into registered sex offenders in the area, recent parolees, and anyone with a record of assault involving knives or sharp instruments. Nothing solid came from those efforts. Without eyewitnesses or a suspect seen with her that night, the investigation had reached a standstill by early 1993. The fact that Angela had been attacked outdoors, in a public access area, meant that even a prepared forensic team could find their work complicated. Dirt and water make it easy for footprints or tire marks to be altered or erased. The canal path could be accessed from numerous streets, making it hard to even pinpoint where the attacker might have come from or left. Within the police department, there was talk about whether this could be a one-time incident or the work of someone who might target again. The sexual assault and post-mortem mutilation suggested more than just a single outburst of violence. Still, without a second crime, there was no way to measure whether this killer had an ongoing pattern. Angela Brosso's family, particularly her mother and boyfriend, were left without answers. The loss was compounded by the way the attack had happened and the fact that she had been so close to a milestone birthday. Friends organized memorial bike rides, partially to honor her and partially to remind riders to stay alert when using the canals. Phoenix police kept the case open, waiting for any development. They did not have to wait long for confirmation that something broader was happening. Less than a year later, the canal system would be the location of another killing. The similarities to Angela's murder would make it clear that Phoenix was facing a repeat offender. That next case began in September 1993. Like before, it involved a young woman traveling alone along the canal on a bicycle. Like before, she would not make it home. The discovery of her body would push the idea of a canal killer from private police discussions into the public conversation. And this time, details at the crime scene would raise even more questions about what drove the person responsible. The warning signs for the community were all there after Angela's murder. Random targeting, a comfortable use of the canal's isolation, and a level of violence far beyond what most killers display. Yet without knowing who was behind it, there was no way to prevent them from striking again. When the second victim was found, the message was unmistakable. This was not somebody satisfied with one crime. The killer was still out there, moving among the same paths and underpasses where people walked and cycled every day. In September 1993, the canals of Phoenix claimed another life. This time, the victim was 17-year-old Melanie Burness, a high school student who balanced her time between classes, friends, and extracurricular activities. On the afternoon she disappeared, she set out on her bicycle along a stretch of canal path not far from her home. Friends and family described her as responsible and reliable. Her route was familiar, and like Angela Brosso before her, she was comfortable riding alone. It was early evening when she left, intending to return home that night. She never arrived. When Melanie did not come home, her family immediately feared something was wrong. They contacted the police, and an initial search began late that evening. Officers and volunteers checked the nearby streets and alleys, but there was no trace of her or her bicycle. By the next morning, the search had widened, and the canal itself became a focus. A utility worker spotted her body floating in the canal the following day. Recovery was slow and methodical, as officials needed to preserve as much evidence as possible. Once her body was brought to shore, investigators could see she was still wearing a blue bodysuit, similar to what she had left home in. The clothing was intact, but the presence of water had already begun to compromise trace materials like hair, fibers, and fingerprints. Detectives immediately noted similarities to the Angela Brosso case: a lone female cyclist, a canal location, and evidence of sexual assault. One detail in Melanie's case stood out and would remain one of its most chilling aspects. Carved into her skin were letters. They were shallow enough not to be the fatal injury, but deep enough to be deliberate. The marks did not form complete words that investigators could recognize, and they could not be explained as accidental damage caused by debris in the water. This raised questions about whether the markings were part of a ritual, an attempt to leave a signature, or a way for the killer to shock those who found the body. Whatever the intent, the act took time and a level of comfort after the assault had ended. By 1993 standards, forensic technology was limited in what it could do with certain types of biological evidence. While investigators collected swabs and samples from the body, the ability to process degraded DNA from waterlogged material was still developing. The canal water was treated for city use, containing chemicals and bacteria that could damage cells. Clothing contamination was a major problem, with silt and plant material embedding into fabrics. Even latent prints on items like a bicycle frame could be rendered unreadable after a night underwater. The letters carved into her skin were photographed and measured, but without knowing the meaning, they did not immediately advance the case. Detectives compared them to gang symbols, initials, and even occult markings known from other cases, but there was no match. Still, the choice to leave such marks indicated that the killer saw the victim's body as a message board of sorts, which is often linked to offenders who want recognition for their crime. It also showed an escalation from the previous canal murder, moving from post-mortem mutilation of one kind to a more communicative type of marking. The location reinforced the idea that the offender was using the canal system as both a hunting ground and a disposal site. In both murders, the victims were last seen alive on bikes, in areas not far from apartments or homes, but quiet enough for an attacker to move without drawing attention. Access paths were unlit at night and often out of direct view from nearby roads. The canal banks themselves could be climbed down to secluded spots, offering an attacker time to act before dumping the body into the water. Linking the two cases became a priority for Phoenix police. While the physical evidence in each alone might not have been enough to identify a suspect, the similarities in victim profile, location type, and level of violence were strong indicators. This could be the same person. Detectives from the Brosso investigation were brought in to consult on Melanie's case. They compared timelines, scene photographs, and autopsy findings side by side. The parallels were too close to dismiss. By the time Melanie's body had been examined and her cause of death confirmed, the media caught on to the similarities. Reports began using the term canal murders to describe the two cases. This framing increased public awareness, but also added pressure to the investigation. Families in Phoenix were told to be cautious when using the canals, especially young women traveling alone. Community meetings were held to discuss safety, and police presence along the paths temporarily increased. At the same time, investigators were careful not to release too many specifics to the public. Details like the carved letters were kept quiet for years, known only to a limited number of people. This was deliberate. If a suspect confessed or was overheard sharing details later, police could verify whether they truly had knowledge. Only the killer would know. That kind of hold-back information is standard in major investigations and can be crucial in court. The forensic limitations of the early 1990s proved frustrating. DNA analysis was just making its way into courtrooms as reliable evidence, but methods for recovering and amplifying small or compromised samples were still in their infancy. The samples from both victims were preserved, but in a form that could not yet be fully tested. Detectives could only hope the technology would advance. They also had little to work with in terms of eyewitnesses, Both attacks appeared to have occurred in areas and times where foot and bicycle traffic was low. No one had come forward to say they saw the victims with another person before the murders. The similarities between the Brosso and Burness murders gave police something to work with, but it also brought them into a race against time. If the killer struck twice in less than a year, there was reason to believe he could do it again. Task forces were assembled, interviews conducted, and every known offender in the area with a violent history was considered. Undercover officers were sent along parts of the canal as a deterrent, but without knowing more about the suspect, proactive measures were limited. Melanie's family was left with the same kind of unanswered questions that Brosso's family had faced 11 months earlier. The brutal nature of the murder, the strange markings, and the randomness of the attack made it harder to process. There was no personal dispute to point to, no robbery, no clear motive beyond the killer's apparent desire to harm and degrade. The emergence of a second case meant that the police now considered these killings part of a connected series. The term canal killer began circulating informally within the department, and profiles were drawn up that considered the offender's comfort with water locations, possible experience in restraining victims quickly, and willingness to spend extra time after death with the body. Each of those factors suggested someone who did not fear being caught in the act. With the community on alert and investigators pooling resources, the hunt for the killer was fully underway. But despite the growing file, 2 victims, similar crime scenes, preserved biological evidence, there was no name to attach to the crimes. The case remained active, but without a solid lead. Momentum began to slow. In time, other high-profile cases pulled resources, witnesses' memories faded, and potential suspects moved or changed their routines. By the mid-1990s, the canal murders were still unsolved, and tips arriving at the police department were more often vague than useful. The investigation would remain stalled like this for years, until technology caught up with the evidence sitting in storage. For the families of Angela Brosso and Melanie Burness, that wait would last decades. The murders of Angela Brosso and Melanie Burness brought an immediate and heavy response from Phoenix police. In the months after Burness's death, detectives put in long hours, interviewing anyone who might know something, following up on tips, and reviewing past cases with similar details. In early 1994, one tip came in about a teal bodysuit seen near a canal bank, possibly connected to Burness. Officers searched the area and collected the garment, but without a victim still wearing it or identifiable markings linking it definitively to the crime, it was impossible to confirm its relevance. The item joined other pieces of evidence in storage, waiting for a time when new methods might reveal more. Investigators cast a wide net. They looked at more than 600 possible persons of interest over the following years. This included known violent offenders in the region, parolees, and anyone with a pattern of targeting women outdoors. They also took in names from the public. Some called in through tip lines, others mentioned quietly in conversations with police. Every name meant background checks, interviews, sometimes even covert surveillance. But nothing that came back led to an arrest. One of the constant frustrations was the lack of eyewitnesses. In neither murder had anyone reported seeing the victim in direct contact with another person before her death. Canals could be busy in the daytime, but the times of day both victims disappeared were less populated. And by the time bodies entered the water, much of the physical scene was already erased. This meant that events taking place even just 50 steps off a main trail could go undetected entirely. Evidence suffered in other ways. Late 20th century DNA processes were not the fine-tuned tools seen today. In the early 1990s, the science could link large, high-quality samples, but it was not yet able to retrieve consistent profiles from degraded or mixed samples, especially those exposed to flowing, chemically treated canal water. The samples taken from Brosso and Burness were preserved under the standards of the time. That meant sealing them, refrigerating if necessary, and logging them into evidence storage. But preserved did not mean ready for immediate use. Every year that passed risked some further degradation, reducing the odds that testing could yield a match with known offenders in the database. Leads that looked promising one day often went nowhere the next. Some suspects were cleared by solid alibis, others moved out of state, and tracing them took months. A few passed away, taking any possible knowledge with them. Without a direct tie, even suspicious behavior before or after the murders was not enough to charge someone. The threshold for arrest required more. Families of both victims had to live through this stalled progress. For people close to Angela Brosso, the especially brutal circumstances of her killing were a heavy weight, and the wait for justice added to the strain. Melanie Burness's family was in the same position less than a year later, just as shocked by the violence as they were by the sudden absence. In the years that followed, these families stayed in contact with detectives, sometimes calling to check if anything had changed, other times meeting face-to-face for updates that usually held no new answers. Inside the homicide unit, the case left its own mark. Detectives who had been there in the early days moved on to other assignments or retired. New detectives inherited the files, which were thick with reports, photographs, lab results, and handwritten notes. With each change in personnel, there was a need to get up to speed fast, reading years of material to understand what had been done and what possibilities remained. A veteran detective could spend weeks refamiliarizing themselves with a cold case of this size, only to find that no new evidence had surfaced to justify reopening active fieldwork. The Canal Murders nickname began as an internal shorthand, but over time it spread into public conversation. By the late 1990s, Crime Watch meetings in the neighborhoods near the canals still heard occasional questions about whether the police had ever found the killer. The answer was always the same: the cases were still open. But without media coverage or new events to push the story back into headlines, the murders faded in visibility for many residents. Technology did move forward, but often at a pace too slow to produce immediate breakthroughs. When Arizona adopted newer DNA testing methods in the mid-1990s, older samples could sometimes be re-examined. The problem was, there were still limitations on size and quality. Full profiles required clean, intact DNA strands, which the canal environments had not made easy to collect in these cases. Databases also had their own limits. Without a suspect's DNA already in the system, even a perfect profile could sit unmatched for years. Detectives did not give up entirely. Periodically, a lead from another case, sexual assaults with similar victim types, or violent acts involving canals, would be compared against the Brosso and Burness files. A few moments looked promising enough to assign surveillance or polygraph examinations, but each ultimately ruled out the subject in question. The effort kept the cases technically active, but the reality was that, without a break, it could continue on like this for decades. By the early 2000s, that is exactly what it looked like would happen. For the families, the long silence was both an absence and a presence. They did not hear new information, but the knowledge that the killer had never been caught stayed with them constantly. For police, the Canal Murders joined other infamous Phoenix cold cases as files to be protected in storage and reviewed whenever a rare, relevant lead appeared. Among homicide investigators, there is an expectation that some cases will remain open-ended, but these murders stood out for their brutality and their apparent randomness. They also had the rare element of possible serial targeting in a city not widely known for such crimes. That combination made the absence of progress harder to accept, even among experienced officers. It was not just about solving a case. It was about the fact that whoever had done it had likely walked free in the city for years afterward. The frustration was shared quietly among those who worked the case early on. Some retired detectives have spoken about the weight of knowing that they had good physical evidence but lacked the means to make use of it. There were no secret breakthroughs, no hidden suspects kept deliberately out of the public eye. The plain fact was that the science was not there yet, and the witnesses were not there at all. The evidence boxes stayed sealed but ready. The lab reports stayed filed in chronological order. The crime scene photographs remained preserved, a reminder to anyone reviewing them that these were not just cases. They were two human lives, ended in a calculated and cruel way. Over time, even newer detectives who had not been on the force during the original murders knew the name Canal Murders from training or from conversations in the hallway. It was understood as one of Phoenix's lingering wounds. For more than a decade, the status barely changed. Then, in the early 2010s, the files landed on the desk of a detective who saw an opening. The technology had shifted enough, and a new approach to using it had begun appearing in other cold cases around the country. What had once been a wall of dead ends began to look like a puzzle that could be rebuilt from pieces still intact in those storage boxes. This detective did not just reread notes and recheck witness statements. The plan was to use a more modern tool, one that could take the DNA collected years earlier and search not just for direct matches in a criminal database, but for extended connections hidden in the DNA of relatives. If those relatives had submitted their information for any reason, like genealogy research, that could create a chain leading straight to a suspect, it was a strategy that had not been available in the early 1990s, or even in the first decade after the murders. And if it worked, it would not just breathe life into the Canal Murders investigation, it could change the way cold cases were approached altogether. In 2011, cold case detective Clark Schwarzkopf pulled the Canal Murders files from storage. By then, they had been sitting unsolved for nearly 2 decades. The binders were thick with reports, photographs, lab results, and lists of names filled box after box. More than 600 possible suspects had been looked at over the years, some briefly, others in depth. None had been charged. Schwarzkopf began going through the material, one page at a time. He was looking for anything that might have been overlooked when the cases were first active. The DNA collected from both Angela Brosso and Melanie Burness was still logged in evidence, tested under older methods but stored in the hope that one day the technology would catch up. By 2014, that opportunity had arrived. Advances in forensic science had created a new approach, one that did not rely solely on direct matches in criminal DNA databases. Instead, it made use of public genealogy resources. People across the country had been mailing in cheek swabs or uploading DNA profiles from at-home kits to learn about their ancestry. Some had agreed to share their information in open databases. That availability created a new investigative tool. If a criminal's relative had submitted their DNA, analysts could sometimes trace back to the offender. Schwarzkopf reached out to Colleen Fitzpatrick, a forensic genealogist with experience working cold cases. Fitzpatrick received the Canal Murders DNA profile prepared by the crime lab. It did not show up as a direct match in CODIS, the National Criminal Database, but that was not surprising if the killer had never been arrested for a qualifying offence. Their profile would not be there. Instead, she uploaded it into a public genealogy database that permitted law enforcement access at the time. The results came back with multiple distant matches, people who were likely third or fourth cousins to the unknown suspect. The process from there was methodical. Each match gave a starting point, a living individual's family tree. Fitzpatrick built out those trees, working backwards to find common ancestors between them. This kind of reverse engineering could link two fourth cousins to a set of great-great-grandparents, for example. From there, she mapped out all the descendants, including those who had moved far from Arizona. Dozens of names turned into hundreds as the trees connected. The goal was to find intersections, branches where the family lines crossed, pointing toward a more recent shared relative, who could be the suspect or the suspect's siblings. Over weeks of work, one surname began appearing more often than others in the relevant lines. Miller. It did not immediately identify a single person, but it narrowed the pool. Now the task was to follow the Miller family descendants forward in time to the early 1990s, in Phoenix or nearby. Fitzpatrick built timelines for each candidate, where they lived, their ages in 1992 and 1993, any known criminal activity, and whether they had the physical ability to commit the murders. From hundreds of Millers, the list shrank. Many could be ruled out quickly, too young, too old, living out of state during the Canal Murders, incarcerated, or deceased well before the crimes occurred. Background checks on those remaining turned up a range of minor offences, but only one man stood out with both a violent history and proximity to the canal areas at the right time. His name was Brian Patrick Miller. In 1989, as a teenager, he had stabbed a woman in Phoenix and served time in juvenile detention. The sealed nature of juvenile records meant that detail was not in public view, but it was known in law enforcement circles. His age lined up. He would have been in his early 20s during the murders, and his known offence history showed the capacity for public, unprovoked violence. The genealogy work had done what no traditional lineup, composite sketch, or canvassing could do. It had taken degraded crime scene DNA from waterlogged evidence and built an indirect link to a living suspect through relatives who had never met him. This was still a novel method in 2014. Many legal experts debated the privacy implications of using public genealogy resources in criminal investigations. At the time, some databases allowed it, others did not. Fitzpatrick worked within the terms of service of one that permitted law enforcement searches with violent crime cases. She and Schwarzkopf knew that while this process could provide a strong lead, it was not standard courtroom evidence by itself. They would still need to get a sample from the suspect to directly match against the crime scene DNA. That meant a second phase of the investigation, confirmation without alerting the target. If Miller knew the police were looking at him, he could change his habits, leave the area, or in the worst case, destroy potential evidence still in his possession. Surveilling him would take time and resources, and the collection of DNA would have to be discreet and legally sound. The genealogical connection from unknown killer to the Miller family line had not been instantaneous. Fitzpatrick had to work around gaps in public records, missing census entries, and incomplete family recollections. Some relatives did not respond to inquiries, and others had changed their names through marriage or adoption. Slowly, piecing the lines together required checking obituaries, property records, and archived newspapers for events that tied individuals to locations and to each other. Building those family trees was not just listing names, it was confirming relationships, so that when the lines converged, it was clear they were biologically connected, not just coincidentally sharing a surname. Once the trail focused on Brian Patrick Miller, Schwarzkopf reviewed earlier investigative records to see if Miller's name had ever been in the suspect lists from the original investigations. If it had, and he had been ruled out, they needed to understand why. If it had not, that presented another question. How had someone living in Phoenix at the time with a violent youth record and physical access to the canals escaped notice in a search that examined hundreds of people? The answer seemed to lie in the rarity of sharing juvenile records across departments and the lack of DNA matching power in the early years. Without a criminal record as an adult for crimes that would put his DNA in CODIS, Miller's genetic fingerprint remained invisible to traditional tools. By late 2014, the investigative team had a clear target. From a pile of more than 600 possible suspects, genealogy had stripped away nearly all but one. Miller fit every parameter the profile suggested: age, location, capability, and opportunity. He also had a known incident in his past that matched the behavioral pattern: attacking a stranger without provocation, in public, with a weapon. Even with that alignment, the case could not move forward without that last, critical step: obtaining his DNA directly to confirm the match to the biological evidence from Brosso and Burness. And it needed to be collected in a way that would stand up in court without violating his rights or tipping him off. Schwarzkopf and his team began planning how they would approach him. It could not be through a formal interview. Too risky, too obvious. It would have to be casual, low pressure, and create an opportunity for Miller to leave behind something that could be legally collected and tested. The genealogy breakthrough had turned a decades-old set of files into an active pursuit. It had gone from an unknown killer's degraded DNA to a living man with a name, a face, and a violent history. The final move was to step out from behind the paperwork and meet him, without him realizing that the meeting was anything more than an ordinary interaction. By the time Brian Patrick Miller's name surfaced in Detective Clark Schwarzkopf's investigation, he was far from an unknown figure in Phoenix. People recognized him on sight, but not because of any link to crime. He was known for something that, on the surface, seemed quirky and harmless. Around the city, especially at public events, Miller appeared as a character he called the Zombie Hunter. The persona was easy to spot. Miller dressed in a black tactical-style uniform, complete with goggles and patches. Slung over his shoulder, he carried a large prop Gatling gun that looked menacing from a distance, but was non-functional. He attended pop culture conventions, parades, charity walks, and community gatherings. He posed for photographs with passers-by, often standing stiff and unsmiling in character. His costume was clean and deliberate, and the way he presented himself caught the attention of both children and adults. Even local police officers, working crowd control at big events, had posed alongside him for pictures. The risk they did not know they were taking was that the man in uniform, portraying a fictional hunter of the undead, was now the prime suspect in a series of unsolved real-world murders. At the time, there was no outward sign of that connection. For the public, and anyone meeting him casually, Miller's interest in dressing up as an apocalyptic figure was just part of Phoenix's active cosplay and event scene. It created a sharp divide between the image he projected and the reality that investigators believed lay beneath. Publicly, Miller's identity centered on a character who was meant to fight evil, someone pursuing dangerous, inhuman creatures in a theatrical way. Privately, detectives believed he had once been the predator himself, targeting living women along the city's canals. That contrast was one of the more unsettling elements in the case. For the people who had smiled for his camera or shaken his hand at events, the idea that there could be overlap between the two sides was difficult to imagine. Miller also drove a vehicle that fit his costume closely. It was a decommissioned police cruiser, modified with decals and lights to match his zombie hunter persona. The car was painted in black and white, with detailing that made it look like an official unit from a fictional enforcement agency. On the sides were logos designed to look like badge insignias and phrases that tied into zombie hunting themes. To onlookers, it could pass for a law enforcement vehicle at first glance, especially at events or from a distance. At public gatherings, the vehicle served as part of his display, something people could take photos with, alongside Miller, in full costume. But to detectives reviewing his history, the choice of a car so easily mistaken for a police unit raised questions. A modified law enforcement-style car gave Miller a way to move in public spaces without attracting suspicion, and it could be an instant ticket to trust in certain situations. People tend to lower their guard around what they perceive as an authority figure, even a fictional one. For Schwarzkopf's team, the problem was not just that Miller had a unique public image. It was that this image, combined with the vehicle, could help him blend in while watching crowds, approaching strangers, or moving around at night without looking out of place. It suggested a comfort level with visibility and an ability to be photographed and remembered for something entirely unrelated to the serious allegations detectives suspected. The contrast between the costumed figure at comic conventions and the man linked by genealogy to the Canal Murders was impossible to ignore. On the surface, it fit into a culture of harmless roleplay and community entertainment. Underneath, there was the knowledge that this same man matched the genetic profile from two of the most brutal killings in Phoenix history. Detectives knew the next phase of their work had to keep Miller unaware of that knowledge. If they approached him directly, the risk of him avoiding contact or changing behavior was high. Instead, they planned to confirm the DNA quietly. Surveillance options existed, collecting DNA from discarded items like cups or utensils, but it required legal caution and the right opportunity. Approaching him in an uncontrolled public setting could compromise the sample or alert him too soon. The idea began to take shape around arranging a meeting with him under a pretense that fit his life and interests. It needed to be casual enough that Miller would accept without suspicion, and in an environment where obtaining a sample would be straightforward, that sample could not come from just anywhere. It had to be something he'd used, in a context that lawfully allowed investigators to collect it after he left. In many investigations, this kind of moment, confirming the suspect's DNA, marks the shift from theory to action. Until then, all the patterns, profiles, and connections are, in legal terms, strong leads, but not proof. Proof comes from matching the suspect's own biological material directly to what was collected at the scene decades earlier. In this case, the genealogy work had done most of the narrowing, but without this last step, there would be no arrest. For Schwarzkopf and his colleagues, seeing Miller portrayed in public as the zombie hunter added an unexpected challenge. The costume and performances were known among certain groups in Phoenix, including law enforcement officers who had interacted with him at events. Any approach to collect his DNA would have to be executed in a way that did not tip off those officers that he was a person of interest, since even an offhand remark could make its way back to him. In the months leading to this point, the case had gone from cold files collecting dust to a living investigation with a single focus. The genealogical match had pointed squarely at Brian Patrick Miller, but until that link was secured with hard science, the file was not ready for court. And yet here was the suspect, out in the city, approachable, his face and persona familiar to many. The matter was not one of lacking access to him. He appeared in public regularly, and photos of him could be found in community event archives. The challenge was creating the right circumstances. They needed to place him somewhere controlled, and to be ready, without hesitation, to secure whatever object he might leave behind that could yield a clean DNA sample. The man in the black uniform with the prop Gatling gun, known for pretending to hunt zombies, was about to be approached in a way he did not see coming. Detectives had the target, they had the plan, and the opportunity they were setting up did not involve a crime scene, an interrogation room, or a midnight arrest. It involved a quiet, ordinary setting, one where a drink order and a piece of tableware could change the direction of the entire case. In January 2015, Detective Clark Schwarzkopf made a call to Brian Patrick Miller. The offer he extended did not sound unusual. He told Miller there was a potential job related to security work, something that might fit his skills and interests. The meeting place was a Chili's restaurant, located in a busy part of Phoenix. It was a casual setting, the kind where two people could meet without raising any attention. What Miller did not know was that the conversation about a job was only a cover. The real plan was to get his DNA without him suspecting a thing. Using a friendly lunch meeting gave detectives several advantages. Restaurants provided a controlled environment. The tables, chairs, and tableware were all maintained to food service standards, so investigators could be confident that anything a subject used, like a drink cup or utensil, would carry only their genetic material and not that of random passers-by. It was also a public location, meaning that meeting there would not require warrants or special arrangements. Miller could walk in, sit down, and relax, never realizing he was in the middle of a carefully planned operation. Detectives arranged to be inside and positioned so they could observe without being obvious. The staff had been quietly briefed to hold on to any items Miller used until law enforcement collected them. Care was taken to avoid contamination. Any utensil or cup Miller touched had to be handled with gloves the moment it left the table, then placed into sealed evidence bags. If Miller suspected anything, the opportunity would be gone. Miller did not arrive alone. He came with his teenage daughter. To the staff and other diners, they looked like any father-daughter pair meeting someone to talk over lunch. Schwarzkopf greeted them at the table and began making small talk. The job cover story was simple and believable, giving Miller something to focus on other than why the meeting was taking place in the first place. A conversation like this did not need to go deep. Its purpose was just to keep the interaction natural until Miller had ordered food and drinks. When the server came by, Miller asked for a hamburger and a water. The order was unremarkable, but to the detectives, the water was important. A drink meant a glass or mug, direct contact with his hands and mouth, and a surface from which DNA could be collected. The hamburger, served on a plate, was also a potential source of trace DNA if Miller left behind any saliva on uneaten portions or utensils. Every step of the interaction was watched closely, with decisions made about which item would give the cleanest sample. The conversation stayed light. They discussed the job and Miller's own interests. The aim was for him to feel comfortable enough that he would not rush to leave. Surveillance in the dining area ensured that once he was finished, there would be no gap between Miller stepping away and the items being secured. Restaurants clear tables quickly, so the chain of custody had to be tight from plate or glass to evidence bag. Throughout the meal, investigators kept their distance physically, but remained close enough to observe without losing sight of the target. A restaurant was ideal for this because employees moving between tables acted as a natural cover for police presence. Detectives could blend in as regular customers, working on laptops or eating their own lunches while keeping focus on Miller's table. Miller ate, talked casually, and finished his water. When the plates and glasses were cleared, Schwarzkopf kept the small talk going for a few minutes before the meeting ended. Miller left with his daughter, apparently satisfied with how the meeting had gone. There had been no signs of suspicion in his body language, no sudden change of tone in his responses, and no questions about why the meeting had taken place in a restaurant instead of an office. Once Miller was out of sight, a member of the team stepped in to secure the item they had been watching all along, his drinking glass. It was collected directly from the server before being washed or handled further. Gloves were used to prevent any new prints or DNA transfer. The glass was placed into a bag, labelled with date, time and location, and sent to the lab under strict evidence handling procedures. In the lab, technicians swabbed the rim and tested the sample against the preserved DNA from Angela Brosso's and Melanie Burness's cases. The result confirmed what the genealogical work had suggested. Brian Patrick Miller's DNA matched the DNA from both canal murder scenes. That glass, from an ordinary lunch, had provided the link investigators had been working toward since the technology first became available. The confirmation meant that the case shifted instantly from a strong lead to a prosecutable suspect. After decades of waiting, detectives now had both the original biological evidence recovered in 1992 and 1993 and a direct, admissible DNA match from Miller himself. The time gap between Miller leaving the restaurant and the confirmation at the lab was short in investigative terms, but it represented a massive step forward in a case that had been stalled for more than 20 years. Everything about the lunch had been planned to leave Miller unaware of how close police were. The meeting's casual tone was its most important feature. It avoided raising his guard, which would have made any future contact harder. If he had sensed suspicion, he could have avoided public places, changed his habits, or even left the area entirely. By making the interaction ordinary, detectives kept the door open to move on him when the time was right. The Chili's strategy also underscored how targeted DNA collection works in the field. While popular depictions often show dramatic confrontations or sudden arrests, in reality, securing a source of uncontaminated DNA often happens quietly. The subject may never know the collection happened until later, if at all. The success lies in keeping the moment routine for them, even as every step is being monitored and documented by investigators. For Schwarzkopf, the lunch confirmed that years of file review, genealogical tracing, and strategic patience had been worth it. The connection to Miller was no longer just a possibility provided by family trees and statistical probabilities. It was a confirmed forensic match, capable of standing in court alongside the other evidence gathered over decades. From here, the rest of the work would shift to preparing for an arrest, building the prosecution's case, and anticipating the defenses that might be raised. Miller left Chili's that day without realizing that something as small as a water glass had changed everything. To him, it was just a meeting that might lead to work. To investigators, it was the conclusion of one phase of the hunt and the opening of another, the move from watching and waiting to taking action. 11 days later, police would make that move. Armed with the DNA match and the full history of the Canal Murders investigation, they would take Brian Patrick Miller into custody. For the first time since 1992, the murders of Angela Brosso and Melanie Burness had a named suspect. The long stretch of unanswered questions was finally over, replaced by the hard process of turning evidence into a conviction. The trial for Brian Patrick Miller began in October 2022, nearly 8 years after his arrest. It had taken that long for the case to reach court because of the scale of the evidence, the complexity of the charges, and delays caused by a combination of defense motions and the pandemic. In the courtroom, the prosecution presented both the physical evidence gathered in the early 1990s and the DNA match obtained from the Chili's sting in 2015. Jurors were shown photographs from the original crime scenes, autopsy reports, and the genetic test results that tied Miller's DNA directly to biological material recovered from Angela Brosso and Melanie Burness. The prosecution laid out a timeline that started with the last known sightings of each victim and ended with the recovery of their bodies from the canals. They emphasized the similarities in how the murders were carried out: isolated canal paths, the use of a sharp weapon, sexual assault, and the deliberate mutilation of Angela Brosso. The state's experts explained how the DNA had survived decades in storage and could still be tested reliably using modern techniques. They told the court that the statistical probability of the genetic profile belonging to someone other than Miller was so small it was considered essentially impossible. Miller's defense team acknowledged the DNA match but argued that it did not tell the whole story. They claimed Miller suffered from dissociative amnesia, meaning he could not remember events from certain periods of his life, and that his mental state during the early 1990s had been affected by severe trauma from childhood abuse. The defense suggested that if Miller had committed the killings, he would have been in a mental state far removed from conscious, deliberate planning. They presented psychological evaluations and testimony intended to show that his upbringing had been marked by instability, neglect, and mistreatment. During cross-examination, the prosecution pressed the defense experts on the limits of their conclusions. They questioned whether the alleged amnesia could be proven as a total loss of memory, and whether it could have conveniently covered the exact timeframes of two separate killings nearly a year apart. They also argued that the manner of the murders, a targeted approach, the use of tools, and the steps taken after death indicated control and awareness rather than a dissociative episode. The judge, hearing the case without a jury, weighed these competing narratives. Ultimately, he found the forensic evidence and the similarities between the murders more convincing than the defense's explanation. The DNA match directly tied Miller to the crime scenes, and there was no evidence that anyone else's DNA had been present in a way that could have explained it. The court noted that while Miller's claimed trauma and mental health factors were serious, they did not negate the intent shown by the planning, execution, and aftermath of each attack. One of the critical aspects in the judge's reasoning was the rarity of such a DNA match appearing by chance. Combined with the known details of Miller's past behavior, including the stabbing from his teenage years, the judge concluded that the evidence met the burden of proof required for conviction. He found Miller guilty of both murders. In June 2023, the sentencing phase took place. The prosecution argued for the death penalty, pointing to the brutality of the crimes, the vulnerability of the victims, and the lack of any sign that Miller had taken responsibility for his actions. They stressed the calculated nature of the killings and the impact on the victims' families. The defense argued for life in prison without parole, citing Miller's mental health history, his role as a father, and his lack of adult convictions for violent crimes before his arrest in 2015. Arizona law allows for the death penalty in cases that meet certain aggravating factors, such as murder involving torture or especially cruel methods. The murders of Angela Brosso and Melanie Burness were found to meet multiple such factors. The judge concluded that the aggravating circumstances outweighed the mitigating factors presented by the defense. Miller was sentenced to death for each of the two murders. He was also given decades-long prison terms for related charges, though the death sentences would take precedence. Since arriving on death row, Miller has maintained his innocence. He has not admitted to the killings in statements to the press or in court. His legal team has indicated plans to appeal the conviction and sentence, a process that could stretch on for years given the complexity of capital cases in Arizona. Appeals will likely focus on the admissibility of the genealogy-based investigation, the mental health defenses raised during trial, and whether certain evidence should have been excluded. For the families of Angela Brosso and Melanie Burness, the sentencing brought a measure of closure, but did not erase the decades of waiting. Many had watched the case fall cold in the 1990s, only to see it revived with new technology. The trial gave them the opportunity to hear in open court the narrative of what investigators believed happened, supported by evidence they had known about only in broad terms before. But for all the resolution the verdict provided, the length of time between the crimes and the conviction hung over the outcome. The case also drew attention in legal and law enforcement circles for its use of forensic genealogy. While it was not the first case in the country to employ the method, it stood as one of the most high-profile examples in Arizona. The process raised ongoing discussions about privacy, database use, and how far police can go in using public genealogy resources to investigate violent crimes. Legal experts expect that those questions could feature in Miller's appeals. Even with 2 convictions secured, the Canal Murders investigation left some investigators and family members wondering if Miller was connected to other cases. The similarities between Brosso's murder and certain other unsolved crimes in the area have prompted informal comparisons, though no charges have been brought for additional victims. Prosecutors focused solely on the 2 cases where DNA fully supported the charges. For detectives, the outcome reinforced that cold cases can be solved decades later, but also showed how much depends on preserving biological evidence and maintaining chain of custody over long periods. Without the samples from the 1990s being preserved properly, the genealogical connection could not have been made. It also revealed how new tools can change a case that had once been considered unsolvable. From prison, Miller remains under the same controlled conditions as other death row inmates in Arizona. His appeals will determine whether his sentence is carried out, reduced, or overturned. In the meantime, the details of the case remain part of public record, a reminder of how violence can escape accountability for years until a break in technology or investigative approach changes everything. Still, not every question in the Canal Murders story has been answered. The conviction of Brian Patrick Miller closed the book on 2 specific murders, but other names and faces remain in the background. Victims and potential victims whose cases have not been linked by DNA, but whose circumstances bear unsettling similarities. Investigators have said they will continue to examine those files in light of the evidence now tied to Miller. It leaves open the possibility that the scope of his crimes has not been fully documented. In the spring of 1992, months before Angela Brosso's murder, and more than a year before Melanie Burness, another girl disappeared in Phoenix. Her name was Brandy Myers. She was 13 years old, a middle school student who enjoyed reading and spending time with friends. On the day she vanished, she had been walking door to door collecting donations for a school readathon. Neighbors remembered her carrying a clipboard and wearing casual clothes, making her way along a route that should have taken her back home within the hour. Brandy was last confirmed to be on a residential street about 2 miles from her house. She had knocked on the doors of several homes, asking for contributions to the fundraiser. Then she was gone. She never came home for dinner. It wasn't like her to disappear without telling anyone, and when she didn't return by nightfall, her family began looking for her in the surrounding blocks. When they couldn't find her, they called the police. The search began the same evening. Officers went door to door in the neighborhoods Brandy had planned to visit, asking if anyone had seen her or spoken to her. Several neighbors recalled brief interactions earlier in the day, but no one reported seeing her after a certain point along the street. The police checked around alleys, yards, and nearby washes. Volunteers joined in with flashlights, combing through vacant lots. No trace of her clothing, clipboard, or belongings was found. With no signs of a runaway situation and no communication from Brandy, investigators treated the disappearance as suspicious from the start. Flyers with her school picture were printed and posted on utility poles and in store windows. Even local news ran short segments asking the public for tips, but the leads that came in were either too vague to act on or placed her in locations that couldn't be confirmed. Within weeks, the active search had tapered off, though the case stayed open. At the time, there was no public connection made between Brandy's disappearance and any particular suspect. No one had seen an abduction, no vehicle was reported, and there wasn't evidence of a struggle left behind in the areas she had been walking through. The file remained one of many unsolved missing child cases in Phoenix through the 1990s. Because her body was never found, there was no forensic evidence that could be analysed or preserved for future testing. Years later, after Miller's arrest in the Canal Murders, Brandy's name came back into focus. Investigators learned that his ex-wife had described something Miller allegedly told her during their marriage. According to her account, Miller had confessed to killing a teenage girl who matched Brandy's age and appearance. She said he told her the girl had come to his apartment while collecting for a fundraiser. The details she relayed included elements that fit with what was known about Brandy's last day walking door to door, alone, in a neighborhood that was within range of where Miller had lived at the time. According to the ex-wife's account, Miller said he had lured the girl inside, then attacked her. The story she gave included the claim that he had killed her and disposed of the body in a way that would prevent it from being found. She also alleged that he had described dismembering the remains, an act consistent with the violence seen in Angela Brosso's murder. When this information was passed to investigators, they revisited the records from 1992. They confirmed that Brandy had indeed been working an area near where Miller was living at that time. The suspected point of contact was within walking distance, and there were no other known missing girls fitting her description from that exact date and place. The potential connection was enough to make Brandy's case a focus of renewed investigative effort. However, without physical evidence, no body, no clothing, no recovered belongings linking back to Miller, prosecutors faced a challenge. Homicide cases without a body can be prosecuted, but they require strong and consistent supporting evidence. In Brandy's case, the only direct accusation came from Miller's ex-wife, based on statements he allegedly made years after the disappearance. There were no witnesses who saw Brandy enter his apartment. There was no forensic link tying him to her that could be shown in court. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office reviewed the available material and decided not to charge Miller in Brandy's disappearance. Their position was that the evidence didn't meet the threshold for proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Without physical remains or a confession from Miller himself, securing a conviction would have been difficult. A failed prosecution could have closed the legal door to ever trying him for the case again. For detectives who worked both the missing person file and the later homicide cases, the similarities between Brandy's disappearance and Miller's known crimes have been hard to ignore. In each, the victim was a young female approached while alone near a residential area. In each, there was no immediate sign of struggle left in public view. And in Brandy's case, an apartment setting would have given an attacker privacy and time. Investigators have said they remain open to new evidence and continue to list Miller as someone of interest in her disappearance. Over the years, searches for Brandy's remains have occasionally been conducted in areas where Miller might have been able to access in 1992. These efforts have included checking vacant lots, stretches of canal, and desert land on the city's outskirts. None have produced results. The absence of physical evidence has been the single factor keeping the case from moving into formal charges. Brandy's family has faced the difficulty of not knowing where she is or what exactly happened. While other families eventually received confirmation through recovered remains and forensic testing, the Myers family has had to carry the uncertainty for more than 30 years. They have watched as Miller stood trial for the Canal Murders and was sentenced to death, aware that their own loss is not officially tied to him in the eyes of the law. For the public, the possibility that Miller had earlier victims than Angela Brosso adds another layer to understanding his actions. If Brandy was targeted months before the Canal Murders began, it would raise questions about whether her disappearance was an early step in the same pattern, or if other, unknown attacks might have occurred between 1992 and 1993. Detectives can't answer those questions without more evidence, and Miller has not provided any. The Brandy Myers case remains officially open and unresolved. Police maintain that anyone with information, no matter how small, should come forward. Advances in investigative methods, including newer forms of DNA analysis, could become relevant if her remains or personal items are ever discovered. But for now, the file consists mostly of witness statements, timelines, and the account given by Miller's ex-wife. It serves as a reminder that even when a suspect is convicted of other crimes, not every case connected to them can be closed. Prosecutors must meet strict standards in court, and without meeting them, families are left with unanswered questions. In this instance, the story of Brandy Myers exists alongside the confirmed murders of Angela Brosso and Melanie Burness, parallel in suspicion, but separate in legal standing. The Canal Killer case, as it has been defined in court, ends with 2 victims. Outside the courtroom, in the memory of investigators and families, it extends further into unsolved disappearances like Brandy's. In law, the story is closed. In memory, it remains open, waiting for the piece of evidence that might finally connect the missing girl to the man already condemned for 2 other deaths. Brian Patrick Miller's story shows how the earliest signs of violent behavior can be overlooked. A teenage stabbing, a written plan for killing, and years of quiet anonymity preceded 2 murders that stayed unsolved for decades. His outward persona masked the danger beneath, proving how easily some offenders can hide in plain sight. Justice eventually caught up, but only through preserved evidence and new investigative tools. Even with his conviction, unanswered questions remain, including whether other victims exist. The Canal Killer case may be legally closed, but the fear, loss, and lingering uncertainty in Phoenix have never fully gone away.